the road, an alien was sitting in a deck chair talking to the trees. The sun was shining. I walked out of the shadows and lost sight of myself, leaving behind a trail of hot bananas.
Howdy. Impress all his new friends, well, he'd go for it. And so we thought, he's our man Kerr.
That's exactly what Christopher Boyce said.
Ah, Chris Boyce, yeah. You know, his avocados are terrific. He sent me a case a couple of months ago. I must remember to thank him for that.
Okay, well, that's just about the ground plan. So how did it start to all get together?
Well, for the Governor General to dismiss the government, I mean, there had to be one hell of a good reason, you know?
Yeah.
So we hit on a deadlock between the two houses of the Australian Parliament. And the problem was that Whitlam had a majority in the lower house, but in the upper house, the Senate, his majority was very thin, you see? And the loss of a single senator, one senator, could tip the balance.
Right.
The problem was, how the hell could that deficit take place? Then we found out that there's a convention in Australian politics that if a senator should retire or die,
Researched that one too. Yeah?
we certainly did.
And?
Well, everything was thoroughly run through by the backroom boys before we did anything. Then we found out that up in Queensland, which is a lot like Florida, a lot like Miami, as a matter of fact, there turned out to be just the man we needed for the job. Bit of a fruitcake, you know, quotes the Bible, hates commies, and it turns out he would do anything. I mean, he would do anything to get rid of Whitlam. He's the kind of Archie Bunker we pensioned out of the CIA years ago. And there he was, this Archie Bunker type character up there in Queensland with power. I mean, real power. And we didn't even have to bribe him to be like that. I mean, he was heaven sent. So we chose our senator.
At this point, under the Freedom from Information Act, Mr. Deacon, I must say I'm constrained by the American Constitution to play you this tape that I'm holding. And it's a bugged conversation obtained in January 1975. The bugging was of a CIA divisional head meeting at the CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia. And the speaker is, in fact, your good self.
Okay, let's hear it.
Gentlemen, please. Gentlemen, right. So that is the plan, right? Now, here's our mark. A Queensland senator called Milner or some damn thing. Now, all I need for this job is one small fatality.
That's what you said about Chile.
Yeah, well, there were complications in Chile, weren't there? But here, just a few grains of potassium parfait in his morning coffee as he gazes out over the swaying palms of his beloved Brisbane. And, gentlemen, the problem is solved.
Oh, yeah, but I mean, can it come in under budget? We're not made of money, you know.
Well, is it a fair thing to say that that's an actual recording of that meeting?
It sure as hell is. How the hell did you get that?
It's a bit of pillow talk between an agent of the Australian Republican Union, actually, and a CIA divisional head. She was posing as a call girl, and she planted a little transmitter in the representative's jacket before he went off in the morning.
The RU agent, eh? Well, I'll be damned.
Yeah. So anyway, that was the plan. What were the downside risks?
Well, downside risks, very few as far as we could simulate it. We figured it was basically a win-to-win situation. You see, we knew that Fraser would soon be leader of the Liberals, and that he'd go for a plan to block supply. And with the Senate deadlocked, we knew that our man Kerr would sack Whitlam. So it was all pretty straightforward.
But weren't you worried about Whitlam?
No, we were not worried about Whitlam. See, he and his heir apparent, Hawke, they were both experienced, pragmatic men. I mean, when it came to the crunch, we knew they'd go quietly. We knew they wouldn't lock themselves in Parliament or call a general strike or mobilize the people, and we knew he couldn't fight back through the media because we had it under our control, you see. There was one small hitch, though. We had a couple of other guys, Cairns and Connors, fairly idealistic men of the old left. We thought they might try to rally the people to their cause, so we made sure they were neutralized. Financial scandal, I mean, it works every time.
The loans affair. Right, well, what about the Australian people? Weren't you concerned that they wouldn't tolerate what was in fact a total disregard of their democratic rights, this outside intervention?
Yeah, well, we ran them through too, you know. I mean, Australia's a lot like America back in the 50s. It's a cleaner, saner, more environmentally attractive place to raise a family, you see. I mean, it's still a little unsophisticated. And the people are quiet, mediocre, peace-loving, law-abiding, comfortable, slovenly, and they don't like anything spectacular or unusual. I mean, they hate voting. I'm sure you could become a benevolent dictator by running a policy of abolishing elections. They love reading about the royal family in women's magazines and watching sport and games on TV, and they devote a lot of their thinking on how to build additions to their little suburban homes. So when the crunch came, we knew that they'd rally for law and order, justice, and the American way.
So that was it.
So that was it. I mean, we covered it from all sides. Pine Canyon Agreement would be renewed. The multinationals would remain unthreatened in their control of Australian resources, all through one small fatality. Now, the funny thing is, I get this peculiar aversion to anybody pouring my coffee for me, you know?
You've got to ask yourself one question. Do I feel lucky? Well, do you, punk?
Republic of Australia, Republic of Australia, Republic of Australia, Republic of Australia.
Well, by about the middle of 75, things were beginning to look very shaky for the Whitlam government. And the aspiring young lawyer, Chris Jeffcott, was concerned that the case he'd now been working on for a solid year might not go ahead. In desperation, Jeffcott contacted the judge.
When I asked him about the future, if there was going to be any on this case that I'd been working on against the US government, and he said, well, there won't be a Whitlam government to pursue the case. And he said, and this is what was even more mysterious, he said there won't be a Fraser government either. But he said there might be some sort of other government. And
Some sort of other government?
I thought, what the hell, you know, I thought this sounds like someone's planning a coup or something like that. And then he told me about the ARU.
I suppose at the time you might have thought it was the Australian Railways Union.
Well, most Australians would have thought at that stage that the ARU did in fact stand for the Australian Railways Union, as indeed it did. But of course, the Australian Republican Union had in fact been operating since the 50s as a sort of invisible third force in Australian politics. There was a lot of amazingly influential people in it, and they'd have managed to keep it a pretty well-kept secret.
What did you learn about those members of the ARU that day?
Well, I learned a bit, actually, because the judge showed me some videotapes that were pretty amazing for those days. They were very effective. I mean, now they'd look a bit, sort of old-fashioned, I suppose. But there were a number of commercials that were similar to commercials for products, but they were very punchy in a political way. You know, you had people on a lawn, old ladies, and a cat in the shrubs, and suddenly the cat's playing with a mouse and torturing it to death, and then Jermaine Greer, close focus, boom. Once you've seen a cat playing with a mouse, she says, you'll never look at a cat in the same way again. Once you've seen the multinationals with their claws into a country, you'll never look at them the same way again. a map of Australia with lots of foreign flags in it, and gradually they all go out, and a voiceover explains that if Australia owned its own resources, it'd have a standard of living like Sweden, and a tax scale as low as Hong Kong. Now that was really, effective stuff.
So where did you continue from there?
Well, what happened was we walked outside, and again, when I look back, I think, he knew what he was doing, this old boy. We went down to the car, he gave me the videotape, so I hopped in the Saab to drive back to Sydney, and he says to me in a matey sort of way, well, what you do next, it's your decision. And I thought, So I said to him goodbye, and he said, see you, mate, which is the sort of way he used to talk. And that was it. I just drove back to Sydney with his hot little cargo and thinking that I was free of the whole thing. And
Chris Jeffcott. Shortly after that, Chris Jeffcott went into hiding, suspecting he was being pursued by the CIA and ASIO. Reality rapidly caught up with him.
This is ABC National Radio. We're broadcasting this special edition of AM to all capital cities and country areas in Australia. Eastern summertime is coming up to 8:15. Almost as soon as the news broke, so did violent and ugly demonstrations right around Australia, with a particularly violent demonstration in Melbourne, with police wagons at one stage driving into a crowd, knocking protesters and police alike to the ground. And it seems very much as though the people of Australia may not heed Mr Hawke's call for calm, especially in Melbourne, the centre of union activity. And we'll cross to Melbourne now.
This is Margot Marshall in Melbourne. By 2:30 in the afternoon, the news had spread throughout the city, leaving Melbourneites stunned. By 5 o'clock, the unions had organised a mass protest rally, and thousands of shoppers, office workers and unionists crowded bitterly into the city square.
From what we hear at the State Department, relations between Australia and the United States now are very good. I'm told that the irritant, translated as Gough Whitlam, has been removed from the diplomatic relationship.
Could it have been actually a move by the CIA against an Australian government?
Oh, definitely. I mean, that was the whole purpose, I think, was to get rid of a government that they did not like and did not feel was stable, and a government that was not cooperative enough for their own purposes, and to replace it with a more conservative and a more stable government. In a sense, it's a chilly, but in a much more muted and sophisticated and subtle form.
Well, one of the best-known figures from those shattering events of November 11, 1975, was a man called Harry Bathperson, now one of Canberra's most widely known identities. He told me about his involvement from its beginning to the very end in this interview recorded recently at his plush office in the national capital of the Republic.
Harry Bathperson, from the very beginning, can you tell us the story?
Sure. I was a long-term subscriber to Soldier of Fortune magazine. Oh, that's way before I got into legit business.
Were you a mercenary?
Well, look, let's say I headed off from the land of Oz in the early 70s. Went walkabout on a cosmic surf and sun experience, and I ended up in southern Africa.
Whereabouts?
Well, down round Rhodesia, which of course you call Zimbabwe, and then Angola and Mozambique.
I see. So when did you get back to Australia?
Let's see, I returned in 75, and I got myself a little shack up at Hill End. And after a while up there, living this somewhat monastic existence, well, to cut a story short, I headed down to Sydney, to Coogee, to visit an old girlfriend of mine, and a very pleasant night or two I spent there. Nice sort of bird, really. I remember one night, must have been in October of 75, this young bloke burst into the room. Well, I almost dropped him.
Young bloke?
Well, he was weird sort of bloke, really. Pinstriped suit. Said he was a lawyer. Claimed to be pursued by the CIA and ASIO and all manner of spooks. Turned out to be an old mate of this bird's. And she asked me to help him.
And did you?
Well, yes, as it turned out. I've never had much time for lawyers, and he was a lawyer, and I've always regarded them as a rather mercenary sort. But seeing as how he was a mate of hers, and seeing as how I'd been pursued halfway round the world at one time or another by the CIA and the KGB and the MI5 and 6 and whatnot, I decided to help him get out of Sydney.
And how did you do that?
Now, our first problem was to evade the intensive security dragnet which had been thrown up all around the city.
But with modern-day surveillance, that must have been pretty difficult. What did you do?
Well, I'm a great believer in simplicity. Harry's first law of intrigue, do the obvious. I bought 2 bus tickets to Central Station and 2 train tickets to Bathurst. Problem solved.
And then?
Well, the young bloke settled in up there, and I went back to my meditation and me Tai Chi. But all he ever seemed to do was listen to the ABC News. He seemed to be completely obsessed with the impending demise of the Whitlam Labor government.
Did you see those fears as justified?
Well, to a bloke like myself who's seen a bit of the world, it was perfectly obvious that the CIA, having identified a government antagonistic to its security aims and foreign policy objectives, was now in the process of destabilising that government.
And were they?
Well, they'd obviously sent out a highly trained and experienced project engineer to do the job, and a bloody good job he was doing too.
Do you have any clues as to the identity of that agent?
Well, as it turned out, I knew him quite well, and I could certainly admire his professionalism. But this young bloke didn't see it like that. Just about every day he'd rush outside with some new bulletin. Like the day he came out and said, Jack Lang's dead. But secretly, I knew we were about to witness the whole Latin American soap opera white-anting of the democratically elected government, as you'd say in your TV show, Philippa.
What about the parliamentarians at the time, the ministers?
You know, by this time, Cairns and Connor were long gone, both destroyed by the so-called loans affair and the odd newspaper proprietor, and little seemed to remain between Whitlam and the wall. And I wondered, would he go like Allende on his feet with a gun in his hands, or would he go quietly to an oblivion of ALP fundraising barbies, UN postings, art gallery openings and so on?
And then?